My longest tenure was almost 12 years at the CNIB. When I joined the organization in 2008, the global financial crisis had just happened. In the first 60 days of the job, we lost $30 million on paper. We literally had to go into a crisis management mode. It's so important for a leader is to be very calm. Even though you might be inside churning and feeling like this is going to be very, very challenging. People feed off your energy. As a leader, if you're showing trepidation and you're showing concern outwardly, it may needlessly cause the organization to start to take on that belief. It's usually the things that we cherish and take for granted the most that when it's taken away from you has the largest impact on your quality of life. What we're trying to do is make sure that a person can live independently and also enjoy things that, we all take for granted at a certain time. We're one of the first charities in New Zealand to introduce the 4-day work week. It's not that you work 4 10-hour days in a week. So you still are compensated for 100% of your full salary, but we only asked you to work 80%. So basically 4 days.
Welcome back to Care Beyond Profits. I'm Azura Ali, and in this interview, I am thrilled to be joined by John Mulka. John is the Executive Director of Osteoporosis New Zealand, and he was the former CEO of Blind Low Vision New Zealand. While he was there during the COVID pandemic, he was selected as the winner of the New Zealand Primary Healthcare Award. He received this for the innovation in service delivery. We dive into this and we also talk about leading a $30 million turnaround, how long to stay in an organization to deliver impact, and we talk about consistency, resilience, and family values. If this speaks to you, please like, share, and subscribe to Care Beyond Profits. Let's get into it. So John, welcome to the show. It's a real privilege to have you here today.
Thank you, Azura. It's my privilege to be here, and thank you for asking me to be a part of this. I'm really excited with the opportunity.
Thank you, John. So we'll dive in first, starting off with a little bit about your journey. And so for the listeners here, you're actually not in New Zealand right now. So let's start with, where are you right now?
Thank you, Azura. I am doing this recording from Canada. I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia, which I call my home, so to speak. I'm a born and raised Canadian.
I'd love to dive into a little bit more about that, into your childhood and how you actually entered the space. So are you able to just share a little bit more about that in terms of your upbringing? What was that like? What do you remember in Canada growing up?
Certainly. I was born on the prairies. For those that know their geography, I was born and raised in a city called Edmonton. And as I reflect back on my upbringing, my life was really brought up around sports. I always had a passion for sports. And so in the summertime, we'd play baseball. And then in the wintertime, we'd play ice hockey. It was just, I learned a lot of values in terms of working on a team, being in a respecting authority, whether it be your coach or manager, those types of things. And a lot of those values transformed themselves into business and into the career that I had. So from there, sports actually led me into what now I've spent 35 years. As I reflect back, it was 1990. I got my first job in not-for-profit charitable world, leading an amateur sports organization. And I would have never guessed back in 1990 when I took that job that would lead me to the career that I've enjoyed. And currently today, I've spent the last almost 18 months leading Osteoporosis New Zealand, which has been a really interesting and fascinating change in terms of what the dynamics are of our organization, how we measure success. I'm sure we'll talk about that. One thing that's always common is cause.
No, thank you, John. That was very comprehensive, because you mentioned that your early days played a big part. Basically, you were, into sports and even the winters and the weather. And that talks a lot about the resilience piece that I think a lot of the times that we're trying to groom in the younger generation. So is there anything there that you particularly remember that's shaped you now as you have, gone into your career and probably at the more senior levels now, that you can reflect back on?
I'd like to give a lot of the credit, though, it goes back to my mother and father and my grandmother, who basically provided childcare because my parents were both working, as I said. And when I was a youngster in kindergarten, grade one, I remember staying with my grandmother, and she looked after me and taught me a lot of values. So what are those values? Being on time. Like my parents are from day one was always, it was a non-negotiable. If school starts at 8 o'clock, you're at school at 8 o'clock, and if it goes till 3:30, you're there till 3:30. And, those were values that at the time that I probably resisted or didn't really appreciate, but it taught me a lot about that. And then there was reward, obviously, for hard work. I contributed around the household and doing yard work and doing things. I didn't know any better. I just assumed that's what you did because they instilled those values in me from basically day one. And I'm forever grateful because I think it really shapes the person. And you talk about resiliency too, overcoming obstacles. Obviously, there was no school buses. And the elementary school that I went to as a young child was probably a good kilometer from our home. And there was no excuses. You got to school. I had to get myself to school because my parents got up early and went to work. And my grandmother, as I said, would come over and make sure I had my breakfast, and then I'd dress myself, and away I'd go, and off to school I'd go. And back in the day, I wonder, and I realize we live in a very different society nowadays. I grew up in a society and a community where we never locked our doors. And it's hard, but we never locked our doors. And everybody in the neighborhood really looked out for each other. The kids that I grew up with, parents all knew you on a first name basis. So we had a real sense of community and literally like a team, a team of people trying to raise good quality people. So those values were instilled in me from early days. And I watched my parents. I think I learned by osmosis a lot about the value of a job. So both of my parents to this day only worked for one employer. And that was not uncommon. Nowadays they joke with me because I've worked for 5 or 6 different organizations. And they're like, what's happened here? And I try to explain to them. Well, nothing's happened. That's just society nowadays and how it works. But they really value it. So my father worked for the city of Edmonton, and he was an engineer, as I said. And I think he spent probably 35, 40 years of his working life working for one company. And that's something to be proud of. And the same with my mother. That was how it was done back in the day. And I think there was a loyalty factor that builds into it, that maybe today we overlook, right? And I don't know that this is the time or place to get into it, but you kind of look at it and say, well, if I can go work at a different company, automatically, usually it's money. People, they equate it to money. Well, I think you have to really take a look at how does that, first off, are you enjoying the job? I'd be the first to say, if you do not enjoy your job or get value from, and have a jump in your step every morning, get up for work, then I'd say it's probably not for you. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is it's not always about money. It's about the team you're with. It's about the working conditions. Are you enjoying the job? Are you value add? And all of those come into play. So I get why people spent back in those decades, we're usually employed by one company. So the values that I was taught early on really go back to mom and dad and what they said as a household and just genuinely instilling a sense of community and from an early days.
Consistency, resiliency, doing all of the things again and again repeatedly, which has really made it that now you're able to just do something and not really think too much about it, which these are all foundational things that you've brought up. Whereas, nowadays it's so true that we do jump between so many different organizations. It's probably just the day and age where it is much easier and accessible, but it also shows how much your parents have stuck with one organization. I don't really hear that much anymore. So that's quite a special thing to reflect on as well.
Nowadays, particularly in senior roles, that's my experience, by the way, is I find that I hate to use the word shelf life, but I can't come up with a better word right now. But after, a period of about 5 to 7 years, if you're in a senior leadership role, it's time. It's time for new enthusiasm. And I like to work in 5-year blocks, quite frankly. I've always worked in a 5-year cycle, whether it be a strategic plan, a business plan, a capital project, you name it. And I've had quite a bit of experience across all of those. I like to work 5-year blocks. So my longest tenure was almost 12 years at the CNIB. And I'll explain why it was so long, because I talk about these 5-year blocks. When I joined the organization in 2008, the global financial crisis had just happened. Like literally in the first 60 days of the job, we lost north of $30 million on paper. And let me tell you, those are some really interesting times because we literally had to go into a crisis management mode in terms of how we're manage, not only business today, but longer term. So we had to really change a lot of the ways we did things at the CNIB. And that was an absolute blessing in disguise. So, couple of times in my career, I can say at the time, it felt like, wow, what is happening here? This could be detrimental. The GFC is definitely the first one. And the second experience where that was COVID. Recently in New Zealand was the COVID experience. We can touch a bit about. But in both of those experiences, the immediate reaction, I think is so important for a leader, is to be very calm. And even though you might be inside churning and feeling like this is going to be very, very challenging, people feed off your energy. And obviously, if as a leader, if you're showing trepidation and you're showing concern outwardly, it may needlessly cause the organization to start to take on that belief. And so at the GFC, and why my career lasted 12 years at CNIB, the first thing we needed to do was obviously weather the storm, so to speak, which most companies did, even around the world. Things bounce back eventually. But we learned a very valuable lesson about our organization. It was time for us to start looking at a different way of doing business. We were a centralized model then. So everything was based out of Toronto. For those who know their Canadian geography, Toronto is Canada's largest city. A lot of the corporate offices are there, and CNIB, our headquarters were there. So we were driven out of an office in Toronto. Now, like New Zealand, even though New Zealand's quite a bit smaller, Canada has some uniqueness about it. Western Canada is quite unique in its own, and that's where I was born and raised, and I've lived all my life in Canada. And so we quickly said to ourselves, our country's so vast, it's so unique. We should actually break it into 3 different business units: Western Canada, Central Canada, and Eastern Canada. That was probably the best decision we ever made. Why? We had more relevance in Vancouver and Calgary and Edmonton and Western Canadian cities. And the perception was, which wasn't reality, but the perception was, we were just some organization based out of Toronto who really didn't care about the community. And obviously that's quite important when you're doing the work we are. And so we changed our whole focus, and it actually helped us on a number of levels. Community awareness improved, buy-in from the community, the feeling that we weren't just a Toronto-based organization, but we were invested in Edmonton and Calgary and Vancouver and Winnipeg and some of these cities. And we purposely eliminated a lot of the central functions that were done out of Toronto, like payroll and accounting and all those things. We did it at the local level. Now, one might say, well, that seemed like you created more of a bureaucracy. That wasn't our intent. Our intent was more to say, grassroots community feel, and we accomplished. Like any organization, there were some really challenging times, and we had to win the hearts and minds of people who were probably understanding, skeptical, and what does this really mean? That was all driven by the GFC. So a financial crisis caused us to reflect on our organization and actually turned our service model around, where we went from some really dreadful, we did client satisfaction surveys prior to the GFC. It was very, very low. There was a lot of doubt, a lot of skepticism. It's an organization that tells me what I'm going to do with my life versus wanting me to decide. And so we completely, like I said, flipped the pyramid around and never really looked back in the organization to this day, which I still think of fondly and follow quite closely, is doing immensely well on using that philosophy.
So effectively, a $30 million challenge turned into a win through strategy and also just change management as a whole, isn't it?
Yeah, and then transforming the organization. I know that word gets maybe thrown around a little bit loosely, but we literally had to transform the organization. And just a number of things. The, the client-centric, which was a word that was foreign to our organization, client-centric. And I don't fault anybody who led that organization prior to 2008. That was how it was done for years and years and years. So as you're across the world, unfortunately, if you were born blind or acquired blindness, you were marginalized. You usually went and lived in, residences. You were given menial jobs. You were earmarked that you can't be a chartered accountant. You can't be a CEO. There was just it was actually quite horrifying that there was a list of about 10 things you could do, allegedly. And that was it. So you went and lived in residences. You worked in menial tasks in like warehouse environments, making brooms, if you can imagine. Just really those days needed to change. So as that changed, thankfully it changed for the better. And the focus became that people be more independent in their lives and have choice. Then that caused our organization to change its approach. And that's not uncommon around the world, particularly with the disability rights movement, which I believe in strongly, by the way. And I use the access to public spaces and the built environment and digital world will all be a thing of the past. Now, fortunately, that's not going to happen overnight, but that's the real focus. And so I really, on a professional side, I enjoy the cause, but I also enjoy sitting on boards that have a purpose and meanings. That's one example.
Absolutely, and I can definitely relate to some of the points that you've raised there, John, having a purpose and values, and even through those difficult times, how you actually managed to transform that because of the purpose. That seems like it really held you close to the passion that you're doing, so it really drove the next steps towards what you wanted to achieve there.
Yeah, so that example actually, I think, impacted the organization positively in terms of its outputs to its clients. The other crisis that I learned a lot from and I reflect back is COVID. So, and that's a different one because it actually, I think, impacted the culture of the organization of Blind Low Vision NZ very, very positive. So one of the reasons I was headhunted and recruited to come to New Zealand was to share a lot of that knowledge that I had from Canada in terms of service delivery. New Zealand was very set in terms of Blind Low Vision. New Zealand was very set in its ways of its service delivery, but unfortunately it wasn't, again, meeting client expectation. It was a lot of dictated down versus the client having voice impact on what they wanted to see. So COVID comes along, and of course, being an essential service, we were given some latitude, particularly in emergency situations where we were allowed to still go into people's homes and deliver service system, particularly in crisis situations. But what it did for our workforce is it opened literally all of our eyes and their eyes that we could do business a different way, including seeing clients. So the traditional way was jump in the car, drive to the North Shore if you're in Auckland, or drive to Hamilton or wherever you might be and have to visit the client in the home. Well, we know COVID put a lot of barriers up. And so even our staff started to do business differently, reaching out to clients via Zoom, we're having phone calls, finding ways to make it work like every other business in New Zealand had to do during that time. But it really changed the culture of our organization from this is the way we do it and this is how we have to do it to actually the team coming up with creative ways that how can we do this different? And one of the things we did was during COVID, well, I think we all can relate to, I believe it's the 1 o'clock press updates where the prime minister will come on and tell us all the numbers and what's happening and who's been good and who's been bad, stuff like that. Those,
Absolutely. I think, those were some of those memories we won't forget.
but our staff, to their credit, took that and ran with it and said, okay, how can we create something similar where our clients will feel engaged and we can interact with them and answer a lot of questions, but also have a way to communicate back and hear from them. So, Bay and Plenty, if there's 10, 15 clients within a radius of each other that had never met each other, why don't we create like a Zoom group where they can meet once a week? Because normally when it came to our office, tea or coffee or social interaction, and that was all taken away rather suddenly from all of us. So and it's a really remarkable story. Our tech team created a function through Amazon, through the Amazon Echo. And so we basically went to Amazon and they agreed, and the government of New Zealand agreed to fund it for every client in New Zealand. And there was about 15,000 on our list. We got an Amazon Echo for them and put it in our home. Now, some people were totally petrified of the technology, didn't believe, what is this thing? But what we did is we created a mechanism. So we provided daily updates. We could do in like discussions like this. I remember being interviewed by a colleague that will be relayed it back through the Echo. And it was amazing. The feedback we got, people felt engaged, and that was all driven by the staff who came up with this idea. So we took that one farther and did it internally with our staff team. We had 300 employees spread all across New Zealand, right? And we'll try to communicate with them. So we use that tool as well as our communication tool. So we're one of the first charities in New Zealand to introduce the 4-day work week. And for people who don't understand the 4-day work week, it's not that you work 4 10-hour days in a week. So you still are compensated for 100% of your full salary. But we only asked you to work 80%. So basically 4 days, right? Provided you were meeting your KPIs and your expectations. And so it caused us as an organization to revisit everybody's KPIs, their benchmark, So if I'm in the call center, how many calls a day would I take and how many would I resolve successfully, and create those benchmarks? My KPIs are a little bit different than perhaps somebody who was working as a frontline service staff. But what we found is our productivity actually increased. So people absolutely were loving the fact that they still were getting 100% of their salary. They were working a 4-day work week. Teams sat down, and that didn't mean that basically the organization shut down on Friday, because most people wanted Friday, right? They wanted to make it a long weekend, right? So the teams had to sit down as a team and work together and decide, okay, who's covering Friday? We have to have somebody on Monday through Friday because the business is still open Monday through Friday. And, it built a lot of teamwork, it built a lot of camaraderie. And the most important thing was, these are the words that staff would use in their surveys, our annual cultural surveys, is job satisfaction went out the roof, because with that 4-day work week, you were required to be in the office only a minimum of 1 day a week, sometimes 2, depending on the role and function, and the other 2 days you were working from home. Let me tell you, and all we cared about as a leadership team was making sure that the business was not suffering. And actually, as I said, our productivity levels went up, not down.
That's a really interesting point there. I just wanted to dive a bit deeper on that, because efficiency is something that we always talk about in our framework as well. And it's something that often comes up as, if we do more work and put more time into it, and you're basically saying, actually do less and get more productivity. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you actually monitored that productivity, and also how did you know where your benchmarks were at?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Isra. So productivity, depending on the role you had, like I said, if you were a customer facing role, it's pretty easy to monitor productivity in terms of how many clients you see in a week if you're a rehab specialist. You worked in the call center. Somebody who working in our accounting department or our marketing department or our fundraising department, that's a little bit different KPIs, but there are KPIs, right? Obviously, the fundraisers have a target of how much money they need to raise on an annual, semi-annual, quarterly basis. How many meetings do they have? Those types of things. So the team sat down and literally with a fresh piece of paper said, what are the KPIs? Okay, so then the leadership team, which I led as the CEO, would have a go at it. And did we have to make some adjustments on the fly? Yeah, we did. In some cases, they were too high. Okay. In some cases, they were too low, but we found a balance. It took us literally a one fiscal year to get a balance, to go through it, trial it, etc. And then we came up with what we felt were more than reasonable and reasonable expectations. And it also contributes, by the way, to performance reviews and evaluations and contributed in a number of different positive areas in that manner as well. So that's how we set KPIs. The other thing it did, and I was just as guilty as anybody else in the organization, is I quickly learned how efficient I needed to be with my time. So it sounds like less might have a negative impact, but obviously, same with our SLT meetings. They used to be, morning meetings from 9 till noon every fortnight. Well, you know what? We cut them back to, I believe we started at 90 minutes and even got them down to as low as 75. And we weren't rushing through stuff. We were just being more efficient with our time. People told us on some of the feedback that less water cooler chats, because there's just the work's got to get done, and they valued being able to be at home 2 days a week because, they could take their daughter to school and do the things they needed to do. So there was a trade-off, right? So, but that's how we became a lot more efficient as an organization. And, you've heard the comment less is more, but it actually, in my particular instance, I found it was very, very.
And I think when you're really focused on something, it does push you to achieve that goal a bit faster and further. I think there's some real nuggets in there. I want to take back a little bit more on challenges, because you've touched on a number of them through pandemics and as well as the GFC, which is quite quite big challenges there. And I know our audience will take a lot away from that. In terms of your current leadership role, what is one challenge that you keep seeing repeatedly coming up? And also for those tuning in that are from the for-purpose sector, how are you finding that, and how are you managing it in your experience?
So Osteoporosis New Zealand is very fortunate. We're funded through Accident Compensation Corporation, ACC. And we're funded on the basis of reducing the number of fragility fractures in New Zealand. And I'm really proud, and people who watch this who are New Zealanders and Kiwis should be proud too. We're actually world leaders in this regard. Shocking, because usually New Zealand is, following or takes IP knowledge from some other countries. So about 5 years ago now, the organization sat down with ACC and said, we've got a problem in this country. We've got an aging population. We've got a number of people who are breaking bones, and that's a fact of life. And if we don't address this, the impact on the healthcare system is going to be 10 times what it currently is. And that's not exaggeration, that's fact, okay? Last year alone, just to give you an idea of what this system is, so it's not just a registry. So anybody who's 50 years of age in this country or older who breaks a bone, it's deemed a fragility fracture, and it goes into this registry. Across New Zealand at 21 hospitals, we have staff, 3 staff, 2 medical professionals, and an administrator. who basically work with people in that particular area who suffered a fracture to get them the proper rehab. So that if they broke an ankle, broke a bone, whatever it is, to make sure they get that addressed and getting their quality of life back, but to avoid the second and third fracture, because sadly by the third fracture, mortality is a real possibility. And that sounds a little bit extreme, but that is the fact. So nowhere else in the world is there a publicly funded system like we have in New Zealand. There's countries like the UK who for literally 3 decades have been asking for it, and they've had variations of it. Even Canada, as a proud Canadian, this country here, I say we because I'm in Canada, does not have a system like New Zealand. It's pockets of, a country of 40 million people where one hospital might have a service of a province that has 12 million people in it, as an example, which is never going to meet the need. So to get back to the point, we're fortunate working with ACC, but one of our biggest challenges right now in New Zealand, as we know, is uncertainty, particularly with government and crown corporations. We know that we have the evidence, we have the model, we have all of the facts that support this is a really good investment, and it saves the healthcare system several millions of dollars. Last year alone, we saved the healthcare system, and we've done some really in-depth studies, and we've got it independently assessed to make sure that we saved New Zealand healthcare system 46,000. You heard me right, 46,000 nights of hospitals.
Wow.
And if the average person may not know the answer, it costs $1,500 a day for a hospital bed in New Zealand. So when you do those numbers, you can see the impact we're having on the healthcare system. Problem we have is, like any government in the world, the biggest expenditure is healthcare. And so our goal is to ultimately make sure that this service that's in place that's currently being funded by ACC is actually part of the public healthcare system, which I believe is the right where it should be. It should be as part of the public healthcare system and delivered in that fashion, and should be funded by the government. So we're working closely with the ACC. That's our ultimate goal, is to ensure that this remains in place for perpetuity and it's funded through the public healthcare system. The challenges are, like any government, this is not a political, podcast. We work with everybody and anybody because we just want the best, what's best for Kiwis. We got to get this in the healthcare system, but right now that's a big challenge because the costs, as we know, are quite exorbitant. There's a move to cut those costs, and it's very, very challenging.
It definitely sounds like you're doing a lot there, John, to shift that funding as well internally.
Yeah, that's our focus right now as an organization. We're proud of what we've accomplished. We're proud of the fact that we lead the world. We want to make sure this remains in perpetuity, not just for our own, self-validation, but we see the impact it has on people when they suffer a fragility fracture. And I call it suffer. That sounds pretty extreme, but in some cases, it's quite debilitating to a person. Their quality of life changes, and heaven forbid, but in some instances, it does lead to mortality, which is just awful, obviously. So I think the uncertainty, the economic uncertainty in our country affects all of us, whether you're a charity, small business, corporation, whatever it might be. And we're not immune to that as a charity. Disposable income has dipped. Costs are rising, so people's ability to support a charity like ours, because there's thousands of very, very worthy causes out there. And it's, obviously it's a competitive environment for fundraising, for charitable donations, and people have a lot of choice, and you have to make sure that your ROI for them keeps them motivated and interested in the organization. So right now, what we're doing is two things. We're trying to get what we call our rehab work into the healthcare system, but we're also focusing a really valid effort on raising public awareness and educating about healthy bones, because it's one of the most invisible diseases out there that people really don't know a lot about it. They don't recognize it. And it's usually associated with, oh, it's just old age. That's what happens when you get elderly. Well, that's not entirely true. So we do have some stigmas that we also have to address. But so that keeps us motivated and focused as an organization. And I talk about these 5-year blocks. We just finished an extensive consultation around the new strat plan for the organization that'll take us to 2030, and those are the focus areas. We're going to unveil a document that's been entitled Stronger Together, a collaborative strategy for bone health in New Zealand, which talks about the importance of it being implemented into the healthcare system and the cost savings and the impact it's going to have. And we're really excited by that. We're going to be launching that in October at an event at Parliament. And so we have a lot of things to be excited about in the organization. Despite the challenges we all face, there's no shortage of talent and the job to get done.
Thank you for that, John. I want to drill in a little bit more into the stability part of what you do, because obviously doing all of these multiple challenges that you're navigating, there's a lot to be said for a leader carrying that weight. And so my question to you is, what is your personal definition of enough, and how has it evolved over time for you?
Well, maybe I'm the internal optimist, but first off, most plans, and I consider myself to be quite OCD when it comes to planning. I really love a plan, and a benchmark. Most plans never materialize because things just happen, right? And over the course of your career, you're going to have to accept that, as hard as it or difficult as that might be. But setting realistic targets that show improvement in the organization is how the first step for me, and always has been actually quite successful in my career, is making sure. So in our case right now, I'll try to use an example that I just gave you. Our goal by 2027, June 30th, 2027, is to have the funding for that fragility fracture registry within the healthcare system. So we have a benchmark, right? We have a goal. You do have to, when you're planning, and you can imagine when we sat down as an organization, talking about Osteoporosis NZ and a board and our staff, we had a whiteboard of, and I'm not exaggerating, I believe 20 odd things we wanted to get accomplished. But then you go back, does it fit with the purpose of the organization? And does it fit with the value system of the organization? And so, yes, there's been times in my career where we've taken on too much. We've been too ambitious, and you do have to draw back. And I think that the importance, one of the things I learned early on about strat plan is a strat plan is a very high level document of where you want to see the organization go over the course of a set period of time, in this case 5 years. But it really comes down to the business and the annual plans that you put together, and they're realistic. And I use a very, very simplistic, some people joke, oh, it's too basic, it's too vanilla, the old SMART formula: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic in the time frame. And that served me well. And it's probably
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's probably helped me with the enough,
Absolutely. And so sometimes we forget the foundational things, and this is such a clear example of that, John. Thank you for sharing that, and appreciate this. So before we end today, I just want to ask you a final question. If you had a superpower, what would that be and why?
It's odd because then I'd be out of work. But the needs that some of these organizations are addressing, I would love to see them not. I'd love to see osteoporosis not be needed because it's been dealt with, right? There's a system in place, it's fluid, and everybody understands what it is, or there's no need for it. That would be amazing, because I think the barriers and the marginalization and the challenges that it creates for individuals is really what I feel is unfortunate and something in life I'd love to change. You know, if I could tomorrow change that no person in the world loses their sight, I would do it in art. Um, if I could change that nobody in New Zealand, let's focus closer to home, suffers a fragility fracture, I'd do it in art because of the impact it has, not only on the individual, but on systemically through society and a few other things.
Thank you, John. You've shared so many gems with us today, and the insights, I'm sure everyone will take away at least one thing from this at the minimum. I certainly have learnt a lot about your journey, so thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Zara.